Hello, my name is Jacob Monk. Welcome to this short video about a very famous Danish actor called Asta Nielsen. Well, probably you don't know anything about Asta Nielsen, but the reason is that she died in 1972. Actually, she's buried in her cremated grave in the grave of the anonymous people here on the cemetery about 500 meters from where I'm living here in Valby, Copenhagen. Asta Nielsen was one of the first, maybe the single first female superstar of movie cinema. She started up making her first film called The Abbey in 1910. This film was made by her husband, Urban Gad. He was a film instructor at that time. He was one of the first men in the world experimenting with movie films. And you have to understand, in 1910, there was no sound on the films. When they showed a film in the cinema, they had a musician, probably a piano player, to play to make the sound. And if there was any problems with understanding what the film was about, there were some titles, some big explanations in text coming maybe every half minute or every minute. But the actors, they didn't speak, at least you couldn't hear what they were saying, because it was not technically possible to make sound movie at that time. It took about 7, 8, 9 years before the sound movie was invented. And here, 1910, it was before the First World War. Asta Nielsen, actually, she came to an audition to this first film called The Abbey, not because she wanted to be a movie star, because there was nothing like a movie star in 1910. Movies was considered a low-level media for artists. Most people believe that movie theater would never be a real art form. But people just loved to go to the cinema. We had many cinemas also here in Copenhagen, Denmark, and also other places in Europe, in Russia, in France, in America, and not least in Germany. In Germany, they had a lot of movie theaters. And there they showed these moving pictures. Many of them were not very long, maybe 15 minutes. But The Abbey, the first cinema where you could see Asta Nielsen, it was 45 minutes long. And in this film, Asta Nielsen, she showed her huge talent as an actor. Actually, she was educated as an actor, and she had been performing on many theaters here in Copenhagen and in Denmark. So she was a skilled actor, but as an actor, she was used to speak to the audience from the scenes of the theater. But now she could only use her body language, and she developed a very expressive body language, and she used makeup that made her appearance, her face, very, very special. She had big eyes and huge expression. Actually, she was considered an international sex symbol of that time. And probably that is one of the reasons that she was world famous very fast. So the Germans, they sent delegations to Denmark to get in contact with Asta Nielsen and they made her an offer. She would get high salaries if she went to Germany and make films in Germany. And that is exactly what she did. She went to Germany, and in Germany she was very famous. Actually, Asta Nielsen was considered the biggest international movie star before the First World War. But when the war started up, she couldn't make any more movies, so she moved back to Denmark. And after the end of the war, 1918, she moved to Germany again. And Germany was not destroyed at all in First World War, because the war had been going on in Belgium, in France, but not in Germany. So Germany was perfectly intact, and the whole industry, including the film industry, could just continue after the war as they had done before the war. Asta Nielsen, she made 70 films without any speak. And at a certain moment after the First World War, there came this technological development, and the speech film was developed. Now it was possible to make films with speak, and that made a big problem for Asta Nielsen, because Asta Nielsen, she was a Dane, and she didn't speak German very well. She could speak a little German, but not perfect. And that's why the film instructors, they didn't want her to play the leading role in the movie theater films, because the German audience wanted German actors to play the leading role. And they could hear that Asta Nielsen was not a German actor. That is why in 1937, Asta Nielsen, she moved back from Germany to Denmark. Well, at that time she had been married twice. First, she had been married to Urban Gad, the instructor of her films in Denmark. After that, she had been married to a Swedish actor for a few years. And then she had been living together with a Russian actor called Grigory Shamara. But that ended up in 1933, just about the time where she made her last movie. And her last movie, actually, it was a movie with speech, but she couldn't play the leading role because her German language was not perfect. So she decided to move back to Denmark. Also because, Adolf Hitler, he had the power in Germany from 1933. And Asta Nielsen, being a leading movie star in Germany, the Nazis wanted her to participate in the propaganda movies made by Göring. But Asta Nielsen, she didn't want to participate in the propaganda movies because she didn't like the Nazi ideology. But on the other side, Asta Nielsen participated in one big party where she was invited by Hermann Göring, and she was the table lady of Adolf Hitler himself. That means she was sitting beside Adolf Hitler himself, and that was considered a great honor by the German politicians. But Asta Nielsen, she was kind of marked by this meeting with Adolf Hitler. That meant when she came back to Denmark, she was considered pro-German and partly Nazi-inspired. And that's why when she moved back to Denmark, she was not able to make any more movies, except for one single movie that was a portrait movie about the history of Asta Nielsen. This film was made in around 1970, and a famous Danish actor called Henrik Stangerup, sorry, not an actor, an author, a famous Danish author, Henrik Stangerup, he was hired to interview Asta Nielsen. But this young author, he didn't have the respect that she considered necessary. He called her Mrs. Nielsen, and she didn't like that. So she said, I don't want to work together with you, Henrik Stangerup. And then she hired another Danish actor called Axel Strøby to ask her all the questions in the interviews that was the basic content of this film. She wrote the questions herself and gave them to the interviewer, and Axel Strøby, he asked her the questions and she answered. Well, it was a very interesting movie because it told about the history of Asta Nielsen and her life in Germany as an international movie star. Well, Asta Nielsen, she tried to be a movie star in America too. Actually, before Second World War, she traveled to America with a ship, and she had to go through the English Channel. But in the English Channel, there was a German blockade because of the war. So the ship with Asta Nielsen was stopped by a German submarine. You know, the German submarines, they were sailing in the not 100% under the water and not 100% over the water. They were just about sea level. So the captain, he went out of the submarine and on the deck, and he asked the ship passing by with Asta Nielsen, what are you going to do? Because if this ship was a ship, for example, with material for the war going to England, then probably they would be stopped, or maybe even they would be attacked by the submarine. That was the way they did. But Asta Nielsen, she came to the deck and she showed her face to the captain of the German submarine, and he could see that she was the famous actor, a German Danish actor. And she told, we are going to America, not to help England, but to make movies in America. And that was the reason the ship had the allowance to pass by. But this incident was another part of the reason why the Danish considered Asta Nielsen a pro-German actor. And that's why when she came home to Denmark, she couldn't make any more movies. And she came home in 1937. So she really didn't have anything to do. During the war, she was writing her autobiography. It was published in 1946, and she had great success as a writer. The reviews in Denmark said this is a very, very good book, and Asta Nielsen could be a professional writer because she was very much talented. But she only wrote a few novels beside this autobiography. And the autobiography, it didn't tell anything about the love affairs and the husbands of Asta Nielsen. And it didn't tell anything about her child. In 1901, Asta Nielsen had her first and only child. She never told anyone who was the father to this child. The child was called Asta, and Asta, she was not very beautiful to look at. Asta Nielsen herself, she was, well, quite handsome to look at. She was considered a super sex symbol, but that was mostly because of her very, very nice body. She was able to move her body in any kind of sexy ways, and she had this fantastic face, being able to hypnotize men looking at her and looking at her pictures. But sorry to say, Asta Nielsen's daughter was not as beautiful as her mother and not as talented. But she married a Danish man, and this man, he died around 1960. And after the death of her husband, Asta was so unhappy that she took her own life in 1964. And this was a big, big tragedy, not only for Asta, but also for Asta Nielsen, because Asta Nielsen, she told the press and everyone that Asta was the only person in her life she had really loved. Her 3 husbands and her 4 men she had been living together with had never been real love affairs for Asta Nielsen. Of course, Asta Nielsen was a fan of men. She liked men. The first film she made, Afgrunden, she had this strong relationship to a Danish actor called Poul Reumers. Both of them, they made the film The Abbey in Danish, Afgrunden, because they wanted to have more roles on the theater. They didn't know that this film would be the international breakthrough for Asta Nielsen. Unfortunately not for Poul Reumers, but for Asta Nielsen it was. But Asta Nielsen, although she had a lot of male fans all over the world, she only loved one person 100%, and that was her own daughter. So Asta Nielsen was a lady of tragedy, also in the last phase of her life. After the publishing of her book, she started up making pictures. Actually, she painted a lot of pictures portraying herself, her famous face with the nearly black eyes. She put some, what do you call it? She made her face in the way that it looked very good on cinema, and she did that by painting her eyes nearly black. So she had a very special outlook, and that was the way the international audience was used to see Asta Nielsen. Well, in 1972, Asta Nielsen, she died, and she hadn't had anything to do with cinema since she came back to Denmark in 1937. 37, yes. She had been a writer, she had been a painting artist, but she wanted and she asked to be a director of a movie theater in Denmark. But even that was impossible for her because the Danish authorities couldn't accept her pro-German attitudes. But nowadays, Asta Nielsen is considered an icon in Danish film and also an international film, because she was the first female sex symbol and international actor. This was when the leading country in the international film industry was Denmark and Germany. Well, that is long ago. Now the leading countries are USA, China and India. Much has changed since the beginning of the last century. But still I consider, and many people in Europe consider, Asta Nielsen an icon of the movie theater. We can go and visit her grave, although it's an anonymous grave. You will only see a big place with a lot of graves, and they are all anonymous graves because the people being lying here, they have been cremated. That means their body has been burned. You can't see exactly where they are lying, but this is the place where Asta Nielsen is lying. Actually, it's only 500 meters from here. And once in a while, and go to visit Asta Nielsen, because I'm kind of proud to come from a country where the movie theater was invented, where the first movies were made and the first international superstar was born and also died. So this small YouTube video is made to the honor of Asta Nielsen, who was living from 1881 to 1972. Thank you for listening.